Greetings. As people are making their way into the webinar, I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce the Every Learner Everywhere Expert Network powered by ISTE. Every Learner Everywhere recently launched the Expert Network powered by ISTE to offer professional learning and coaching for higher education faculty and leaders to support their students through and beyond the pandemic, including the transition to digital learning. We encourage you to visit the Expert Network website we are posting in the chat for more information and to schedule your complimentary session. So welcome to the Every Learner Everywhere Strategies for Success in Online Teaching and Learning Interactive Conference Series. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. My name is Norma Hollebeck, and I'm the Manager of Network Programs and Services with Every Learner Everywhere. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to take just a few minutes out to tell you about Every Learner Everywhere and our mission. Every Learner Everywhere is a collaboration of 12 higher education organizations with expertise in evaluating, implementing, scaling, and measuring the efficacy of digital learning and its integration into pedagogical practice. Every Learner Everywhere is one of 3 solution networks sponsored by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The other 2 networks focus on advising and developmental education. Here at Every Learner, we work with colleges and universities to build capacity among faculty and instructional support staff to improve student outcomes with digital learning. Our mission is to help institutions use new technology to innovate teaching and learning with the ultimate goal of increasing student success, especially for first-generation college students, poverty-impacted students, and students of color. A few quick housekeeping notes. We are recording today's presentation, which we will share with you after the webinar. Throughout the presentation, we welcome your questions in the Q&A section. If participants raise their hand, however, during the presentation, we will not be able to unmute you, but we will be monitoring the Q&A section as well as the chat. As a biology professor and recovering associate dean, I'm excited about today's panel discussion on evidence-based teaching. Our moderator for today's panel is Dr. Megan Tassin, Director for the Personalized Learning Consortium at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities. Megan directs the Adaptive Courseware for Early Success grant for the Personalized Learning Consortium. In her role, she supports and collaborates with academic leadership from a variety of 4-year universities to effectively adopt and implement adaptive learning technologies. Her work centers on enhancing pedagogy, closing achievement gaps, improving accessibility, and ensuring that students from all walks of life have the support and resources necessary to graduate. Megan is a social scientist by training. Her expertise in qualitative and mixed method research. She has taught introductory and upper level courses at the University of Northern Iowa and Georgia State University. In addition to project management and sociological research, she has extensive experience in program evaluation, faculty development, instructional support, and active learning communities. She has a PhD from Georgia State University and an MA from the University of Northern Iowa. Today's panelists are Dr. Ryan Luke, Adaptive Learning Program Director at the University of Louisville, and Patricia O'Sullivan, instructor in the School of Pharmacy at the University of Mississippi. Dr. Luke has previously served as both PI and grant manager in the Adaptive Learning Program while researching the efficacy of teaching and learning practices. Ryan is an assistant professor of mathematics and has taught college-level mathematics and statistics for over 10 years. In addition to mathematics, he holds a degree in computer science and began investigating digital courseware because of his interest in mathematical computing. His passion for teaching and love for students fueled his dedication to student growth and success initiatives. Ryan serves as a partner to the Delphi Center for Teaching and Learning to aid faculty in implementing adaptive and personalized learning through digital solutions. He continues to research and share ways to improve course design for more significant learning outcomes. Patty has worked in higher education since the year 2000 as an instructor, student advisor, faculty development specialist, and instructional designer and grant manager. She has taught world religions at the University of Mississippi for 14 years and currently teaches health ethics in the University of Mississippi School of Pharmacy. In September of 2020, Patty joined Every Learner Everywhere, and in her role as content manager, she works with the network partners to develop, update, and curate Every Learner resources. She holds a BA in Communications and from University of Massachusetts Amherst, an MA in Theology from Assumption College, as well as an MA in History from the University of Mississippi. I'm now going to hand it over to Megan.
Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, excellent. Always got to do that additional sound check. Thanks for joining us today, everybody. And then thanks again to both Patty and Ryan for being a part of this conversation. My name is Megan Tessine. As Norma mentioned, I'm the director of the Personalized Learning Consortium at APLU. As one of the network partners of the Every Learner Everywhere network, we work very closely with institutions to help integrate technology into teaching and learning practices. And we are learning a lot along the way with many folks from institutions that we've been working with, such as Patty and Ryan. Our work primarily focuses on supporting faculty to improve student outcomes. We're really focused on what's working best and establishing an evidence base for teaching practices and learning practices to really have an impact for students' lives. These are terms that are getting thrown around a lot more without necessarily a whole lot of clarity or conversation around what these mean. So that's what we're here to do today. We'll be having a chat with both Patty and Ryan about what does this actually mean, why is it important, and what are some of the impacts we're seeing, and how can folks get involved and learn more about doing this work. So again, thanks Patty and Ryan for joining us today. As Norma mentioned, please throw your questions into the Q&A and we will get to those as we can. We'll also try to answer those that we're not able to answer live. So without further ado, we'll just go ahead and get started. Patty, I'll start with you with our first question. So again, this term evidence-based teaching is a term we're hearing a lot more often. So from your perspective and the work that you've been doing, what does this mean and how are we seeing it being translated into the classroom?
Thank you, Megan. It's really great to spend some time on a Friday afternoon with you and my good friend Ryan. So this is fun and welcome everyone. So evidence-based teaching, it actually grew out of a movement in the latter part of the last century, which started with evidence-based medicine. Believe it or not, medicine was not always evidence-based. And that was a movement that started in the 1980s, where medicine diagnosis and prescriptions and not that there was no evidence, but it became more based on evidence and not just tradition and experience and trial and error, which a lot of medicine was. And so in the late 90s, there was a big national conference in the UK around teaching for K-12. And this is where the term evidence-based teaching really kind of took off. And so the movement spread across the world, and in the United States in the 2000s, it really became kind of a thing. So we've been swimming in evidence-based teaching for about 20 years. But really it comes down to learning science. A lot of work has been done on learning science, how humans learn, how the brain processes and remembers information, how memory works. And so it really is putting together teaching practices and basing teaching practices on learning psychology and also cognitive psychology. Did you want to add anything, Ryan?
Yeah, I was going to come off mute. Sorry, I was looking for the unmute button. I agree, Patty. I think that as we talk about evidence-based practices, what that has come to mean colloquially on campus is that no longer looking at traditional instruction. And what I mean by that is in our institutions, we've taught this just lecture approach for hundreds of years. And now we're looking at other ideas that actually make a difference or have been shown to make a difference in student progress. And I think as a statistician, the thing that I would say is that's difficult to measure a lot about how do we know that we've actually done something that improves student performance. And, you know, teachers continue to try and work different things in their classroom and they see something that's effective, but we've been hesitant to publish those things as often as we could have because that wasn't accepted as scientific research for so long. And now I agree with you, it's only become popular in the last 20 years. And then the other thing that I was going to add is that I rarely have a conversation about evidence-based practices or cognitive science without mentioning John Hattie's work, where he reviewed a lot of metacognition strategies and talked about effect size of different teaching methods.
Thank you both. Excellent descriptions. Appreciate both of those and the history lesson from our history buff. Thank you, Patty, as well. So in terms of—
That's what you get when you have a historian on your panel.
Absolutely. We'll ask Ryan all the math questions later. Ryan, we'll keep this one to you. So why is this so important in terms of thinking about evidence-based teaching practices when considering how to actually teach your course? From the instructional standpoint, and then perhaps even from the institutional standpoint?
You know, I think that's a great question, Megan, and largely it depends on who you ask. To me, it goes back to some of our own personal teaching philosophies. How do I see myself as an educator? Am I someone that is just disseminating information, or do I carry the responsibility of helping my students grow and learn and leave my class with something that they didn't have to begin with? And I teach a lot of core undergraduate courses, and in my own idea, I want my students to be better prepared for something in life, not just they've just completed math class, but that there's some that it relates to. There's something that it relates to in their life outside of college, and I want to see that growth. And if that's what I want, I need to focus on what is actually preparing my students to do that. What is effective? And I think I'm sure everyone on this panel now would be willing to say that standing in front of a classroom, reading out of a textbook is not helping my students do that. And so I think evidence-based practices are important because I want my students to have learned something and be able to do something when they leave.
Yeah, I want to build on what Ryan said about effective teaching. Evidence-based teaching is effective teaching, and it also is equitable teaching. I mean, if we, again, I won't go into a history of higher education, but higher education was designed primarily for wealthy men, wealthy white men, and using evidence-based practices opens up teaching so that it's designed for the way everyone learns, and also you can target it for the way particular groups learn. And not to say that there are learning styles, we know that's a myth, but just to say that there are particular practices that are especially effective with certain groups that we've left behind in higher education, in all education, but particularly in higher education. So I would just argue that evidence-based teaching is both effective, but it's also equitable.
I think that's an important distinction, and I'm glad you mentioned it because I wanted to talk about equity as well, because that is why we are doing what we're doing. Just in terms of kind of what you're seeing on the ground from your universities, as well as many of the other institutions you're working with, in terms of thinking about what is equitable teaching practices, what are the kinds of conversations that are happening between faculty and teaching and learning centers, and how are they trying to ensure that they are actually implementing practices that are trying to meet their students' needs from all walks of life? Patty, we'll start with you for that one.
Thanks. I mean, I can just speak for my institution. The University of Mississippi has a 5-year Pathways to Equity plan. We are going to launch a workshop in May next month on teaching for inclusion. We're going to have a faculty learning community over the next year. And we want to do some measurements. So we want faculty to choose an intervention based on evidence-based teaching, particularly around equity, try it out in their class, measure its effectiveness, and really produce some data from this. So not just continually teach through and be informed by anecdotes, but really have an evidence-based approach to how we're going to change teaching. So we're inviting faculty to do that. It's not required. We're going to provide stipends to incentivize faculty, but also to pay them for the work, because this is a lot of work. It involves course revision. It involves training. It involves doing reporting and measurements. So, and also just involves a lot of talking to and listening to students. How is this affecting them? And is it working for them? And, what is their user experience? And so there's a lot of work that goes into this. So that's just one way one university is doing it, but I know there's a lot of universities across the country that have similar strategic plans around equity that are doing similar work.
Thanks, Patty. Ryan, would you like to add anything on this point of what's going on at the University of Louisville?
Sure. So the University of Louisville, we have taken a step farther, and we have said we want to become a premier anti-racist university, which for us is not just educating or being complacent about things or making sure that we don't make racist statements, but that we're have activism against it, and that we're actually starting conversations and moving progressively forward to make sure that that doesn't exist on our campus. And I think I appreciate what Patty brought up about some of the traditionalism in higher education. What we now serve an audience that is very different than 400 years ago. And we have single parents, we have people that work multiple jobs, and we have people that come from a load of student debt that are just trying to graduate. And all of those people have the distractions in their life that prevent them from doing some of the things that we might have set as expectations if we were gatekeepers. And so I know one of the evidence-based practices, or I guess areas of evidence-based practices, is how do we become supportive educators? How are we accepting that those differences come into the classroom? And what are we doing to be facilitators or guides through the course, rather than just the gatekeeper of information and stopping people that don't make our expectations?
Oh, thank you both for that. And then Patty, you had also, both of you had mentioned, in terms of really shepherding students through this process, as well as involving students in this process, and giving, like, how are folks, because I think you're absolutely right, evidence-based teaching practices is effective and equitable and focused on equity. So, what are we seeing in terms of how are institutions actually involving students or getting feedback from students and integrating that to shape either their policies or their teaching practices? And I'll kick that to you first, Patty, and then Ryan, if you'd like to add to that.
So there's a movement, I guess, called the Science of Teaching and Learning. Lots of institutions have SOTL initiatives whereby, and it's kind of like what I described, where a faculty member will design an intervention and measure it in terms of students. It could be the final grade, it could be on a particular assignment that they're measuring student learning. So that's a particular methodology with that. A lot of institutions also have a quality enhancement plan. I know we're in the middle of ours at the University of Mississippi. Our topic is critical thinking. So we're also training faculty to do critical thinking interventions in their course and measure it and really get the evidence of that. But you're right, that doesn't necessarily involve students except as subjects of research. And so one of the things I did, like Ryan, I oversaw an adaptive courseware grant. And so one of the things that we did was we had student surveys every semester to ask students how they were experiencing the implementation of adaptive courseware in their classes. We also held discipline-specific focus groups with students to find out from them, how is this working for you? We're operating under this understanding of of teaching and learning, but you tell us what you need. You tell us how this is working out for you. So we really tried to get at the problem in a lot of different ways. So I think it's really important to include student voice if you can through surveys and focus groups.
So I want to add to what Patty was saying, and don't shoot me, but I think that the pandemic was the perfect storm for actually listening to the student voice. Because for a long time, we've always collected feedback. We've always had teaching evaluations, course evaluations. We've always sent out surveys and asked students how they felt or what they thought, and measured things. But for us to actually use that to fuel change, we needed something like the pandemic that caused everybody to hit stop, pause, and reflect on, okay, now what do we do? We want our students to finish. We don't want our students to get lost. We don't want them to drop out. We don't want them to quit. We want them to re-enroll. And it became just a question, not just for supporting students, but also to make sure that the university continued to thrive. So then we did all of this outreach about, okay, which of our students' needs are being met? What are we missing? Who is being left lost here, or who doesn't have access to the internet? Where are the equity issues now that we're not on campus? Or who has to have a place to live? So let's make sure that we keep this place open. We learned a lot about our students through this and making sure that they stay enrolled. Patty mentioned quality enhancement program. We too, I think that's a thing that's mandated by SACS for all SACS colleges. And ours right now is looking at students that have not declared a major by the end of their first year, that we are starting mentorship with them and helping them get really plugged into something that they enjoy or that they like, some program to help them continue through that. Another thing that we're doing to it's not so much student voice, but to assess the situation that we're looking at, we use the Association of American College and Universities value rubrics that every year we are assessing the work through the lens of writing, critical thinking, student growth, and diversity in all of these different disciplines, trying to measure improvement or what's happening and look for places that we are still lacking in moving students through.
Oh, thanks both for addressing that. We also had a question that popped up in the chat that's relevant to this conversation right now. I want to highlight it. For some faculty and institutions, they were finding that it was actually more difficult to not only listen to students, but to communicate with students as well. And you're kind of addressing some of the ways that we've always collected information from students to get their feedback. Were there some ways that you're seeing from faculty or at your institution as well? And Ryan, you've highlighted some of those sort of alternative ways during the pandemic that might carry forward, hopefully, because they are good practices to communicate with students and to, engage and listen to them and integrate their experiences into the learning, into their learning careers at their campuses.
So I'm taking the question in the chat as addressed from the perspective of a faculty member and dealing with students directly. I'm hoping I'm interpreting that correctly. And I would say that is absolutely problematic. And one of the things that we launched at the University of Louisville is a committee about, well, it wasn't a committee, it was a work group, like a community of practice for student communication. And for example, I joined that community practice because in the fall, I had over 400 students, and just communicating with students was an enormous workload. And every time the administration came out and said, let your instructor know that you can't make it to campus and we're going to work with you. And I would go, oh gosh, please, no, don't let your instructor know. Just let's do this in an individual basis, because that's 400 emails that were coming in. And we were looking for ways, how do we effectively communicate with students, especially when this large setting, or that they're disengaged or not connecting in class, and they are not reading the syllabus or guidelines that you might post. And we came up with lots of ideas, but for me, I had to implement this weekly communication announcement in Blackboard that I was sending out, regardless of how many times I'd said it, regardless of what we had talked about the week before. But here's your Monday morning welcome from Dr. Luke. And it wasn't just beneficial to the students, it was beneficial to me to keep up with where we were and remember that, oh, I really need this feedback from this group of students. So I'm going to put that question in this announcement and get that together. But there were lots of good ideas about how do we continue to engage. And one of the things that you mentioned, Megan, was, differences in online teaching and our traditional classroom setting. And I think what I have learned, and this is anecdotal because I haven't put together the full research study yet, but in my online classes, even though people are looking for distance learning opportunities, they still appreciate those synchronous connections, even if it's an impromptu Friday afternoon question and answer session or something, but there's an opportunity for those to engage. And those that could not attend or couldn't make it were still communicating with me about, oh, I'm sorry I couldn't make it, I had this going on, but they appreciated the fact that it existed.
I'll just add, I did what Ryan did too. I had a weekly announcement for my students, but my first assignment for my students was just a, how are you? How are you doing? How is this pandemic affecting you and your family? Share only what you want. It's only going to me. And so that was one way of communicating with them and letting them know, I want to hear what your situation is. I want to be sensitive to your situation. The other thing I did was I would have a mid-semester check-in with each student. It could be an email, it could be a text, and 2020, spring of 2020, I gave out my phone number for the first time ever to my students. And it was really scary, but honestly, only one student was texting me at 1 a.m. And she really needed to be talking at 1 a.m. So it was okay. But just to say that I opened myself up as a human being more to my students. I shared more of myself with them because I expected them to share more with me. I let them know how I was doing, and a lot of them thought to ask, which I thought was really great. And I didn't have as many students as Ryan. He had 400. I only had 70. In the fall, I have 50 now. But the other thing I do is I'm just constantly checking on them. So if they're falling behind, I email them, I text them. The other thing that I did was I set up, because we're remote and usually we were face-to-face. So I set up, we used to do team-based learning. I set up the teams of students remotely and said, you go at it. You're a team, you decide when you're going to meet. And I gave them a script, and the first thing they had to do was check in with each other. How are we doing? Is everyone okay? Does anyone need anything? And the team leader was supposed to let me know, hey, this person's really struggling, if that person didn't feel they could communicate with me. So I tried to have multiple ways of tapping into what is going on with the students, just to find out how they were doing. And maybe this isn't like an answer people on the webinar want to hear, because it's a lot of work, but it was so gratifying to hear from the students at the end of the semester. Even this semester, I'm hearing from them that they felt really seen and heard and cared for the first time, some of them in their educational experience. And that's very satisfying as a teacher. I wish I had done it years ago.
Thanks for speaking to that, Patty. Ryan, did you want to add something real quick?
Yeah, I wanted to point out something that Patty said, because she said something that one of my colleagues found very successful. They had smaller class sizes, but they set aside 1 week and canceled the class, but had an individual 5 to 10 minute check-in with every student that was enrolled in that class. I mean, I couldn't do that because I had such a large section, but just like Patty, they were having personal interaction with the professor and student. And it wasn't like you were asking them to come to office hours. It was a required meeting. And the faculty member was able to find out exactly where the student was. What did they need? What did they need to learn about the content? And what did they need personally? And so I agree with Patty. I think that was an excellent approach.
Yeah. I'm hearing you both talking about, really creating a culture of care and caring for students and supporting students. which isn't always the case in sort of the traditional model, right? And in supporting students and shepherding them through not only the course, but their campus experience as well. So you've spoken a lot about kind of centering student needs and experiences as kind of like serving as an evidence-based teaching practice. Ryan, I'm going to kick this back to you, just in terms of, could you provide some of our folks who are on the line, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, just catering solely to student needs, but can we talk a little bit more broadly about some specific examples of evidence-based teaching practices that we're seeing on campuses right now? And in particular, if you can, do these look different across disciplines? Are there foundational practices that fit all types of subjects? Are there some that are, universal? That work for those as
So
well.
yeah, the first thing that I want to say, Megan, is that there is a long list of evidence-based practices of things that help you improve teaching or become more effective, or that is helpful to your students, and we could group them and things like that. But one thing I want to point out is that doing anything is better for your students than not, right? Complacency is not working. But don't try more than you can take on in a semester. Just start chipping away at it. And I am not by any means good at it. I have tried to bite off more than I could chew in my own classroom before. But just taking something and say, this is one of the practices that I'm going to work on. And I'm glad that you said supportive. We do talk a lot about student support, but to me, it's one of the most important, because Patty and I have both said something about the distractions that a student has outside the classroom matter. And I think that the pandemic has also illuminated for employers, for the world, just society in general, that this whole separation of work and home life doesn't exist anymore. And we can't pretend that it does. We have a home life, and we have things that happen outside of our job or our schoolwork. And those things bleed into each other, whether we want them to or not. And I think that we as faculty members need to accept that and help our students navigate through that and make progress. So that's one thing, is that I try to be supportive. I tell my students on day one, whatever it is that's preventing you from turning in an assignment, please don't just give up. Reach out to me and let's see what kind of plan we can make. The other thing is, one of my favorite evidence-based practices, and then I'll let Patty talk, is time on task. I remember being in college or even in high school, where it was all about, you listened to the instructor when you were there, and then you went home and you worked on homework. And that might take you hours or weeks. And you had to do all of this work outside of class, but you never had an opportunity to sit there with your instructor or with your team or group of people to work on the things that you do. And we know that time on task is an evidence-based practice, that whatever assignment or activity, especially group work, if we're allowing that to take place in the classroom, where we're all working at the same time, that is a benefit to the student. And so I've tried to do that even when using adaptive courseware, give them that model during my class time so that they can immediately have feedback from me if they need it.
Yeah, Ryan's covered a lot. So I will shift gears to every learner is in the process of putting together a guide for department chairs, but it's for faculty too, called Getting Started with Equity. But it really is based on evidence-based teaching practices. And we've put them into 4 buckets: classroom climate, the design of your course, representation of students in the curriculum, and then assessment practices. So I'll just address those as evidence-based teaching practices. The classroom climate, one of the evidence-based teaching practices that we have is creating what you said, Megan, creating care for our students, creating supportive classroom climates, letting students know they belong. Imposter syndrome is rampant among first-generation students, minoritized students, poverty-impacted students, female students in certain disciplines. So just letting them know they belong. Ryan talks about the gatekeeper attitude, shifting away from being a gatekeeper, like I'm weeding out students, to the growth mindset of anyone can learn this. given the right conditions and given the right time and the right supports. So classroom climate is huge. Representation in the curriculum is another one. Students, a lot of faculty will say that students aren't engaged. It's hard to engage when you don't see yourself in the curriculum. It's hard to engage when you're a minoritized student or a female student or a non-binary student or an LGBTQ student, and the only people you're talking about or learning about are cis white men. So being represented in the curriculum is really important. And then also having representation in terms of the curriculum grappling itself with what they've done maybe to work against the interests or rights of particular groups. A lot of faculty will say, well, I teach something that's neutral, like Ryan's statistics, right? Like my class doesn't have anything to do with equity. I mean, statistics there's so much you could talk about with statistics and equity. So letting students see themselves in the curriculum, letting them see how the curriculum is relevant to their various identities is important. The design is another bucket, the design of your course. Just making sure that the cognitive load that your students have is directed at learning the content, not navigating the technology, not figuring out your schedule. If you lay out all the due dates and, like Ryan was saying, have a weekly announcement, that tells the students that you're organized. They know where to find things. They know when things are due. But if they're having to spend a lot of their mental energy just figuring out what you want, that's really frustrating for students. There's so many other things I could say about design, but I won't. And then assessment too is another evidence-based practice. We definitely know that spaced repetition is really important for students to learn content. We know that active learning is really important. Experiential learning, peer-to-peer learning. So it doesn't always have to be about the instructor, that students can learn from each other. So having collaborative learning experiences in your class, but then assessing students, giving them formative assessments, low stakes, frequent assessments to let them know where the gaps are, to let you know where the gaps are in their knowledge, and then addressing that rather than just having these lecture classes with, 3 big high stakes exams and that's it. So assessment needs to be part of that as well. So I'll stop there, but I will recommend a few titles. How Humans Learn by Josh Eiler, Make It Stick by Peter Brown. Most people know this one, it's been around a while. What the Best College Teachers Do by Ken Bain. Small Teaching by James Lang, and then Small Teaching Online by Flower Darby. I would just get started with those, but there's, like Ryan said, there's so many more. You could just Google evidence-based practices and you could go down a rabbit hole. There's so much information now.
So can I add a specific example? It really gave me delight when Patty was talking about some of the things that you can do in any course. And I wanted to give a specific example. And in my statistics course from a particular textbook, we had a situation where there were 2 different questions that were posed, and a traditional white male name was associated with medical research and asking a statistical problem. And then a non-traditional name was associated with looking at a section of poverty housing. And just mere associations like that are racist and biased. And when a student brought that to my attention, I didn't even see it in the textbook, but when a student brought it to my attention, we pulled that out in class and we talked about it, and we wrote to the textbook publisher and had it changed. And that was something from that point in the semester on, everyone hung on every question that was asked in the textbook that we interviewed, because they were so engaged at how things like that might actually show up in a textbook that, and I'm sorry for white men, that we've been complacent about and just not known until we were educated.
Thanks, Ryan. I think that's a great experience too. And also shows that, if you can actually create some change, and hopefully that was a bit empowering for the students as well. I think representation is incredibly important. That's one of the areas that we're focused on as a network, as well as we're thinking about different types of digital learning technologies and texts and the different types of tools that are being brought into the classroom to make sure that they are inclusive, that they are not, perpetuating stereotypes and problematic beliefs and about various communities as well. So I appreciate you speaking to that point. I do have a follow-up question for you, Ryan, as well, that came from the chat when you were talking earlier. Just a clarification. So just on the time on task, just a clarification for our audience members on what you mean by that.
So time on task was a label that I borrowed from Faculty Guild, because everybody names some of these evidence-based practices differently. But what I mean is, rather than sending an assignment home with students to work on their own, I mean stopping class and having them actively work on the assignment there in class while we're all meeting together. So that whether it's a group activity that they can communicate with their group members, or it's just something that you would have normally assigned for homework, that you are there immediately available, walking through that with them, or just standing on the sideline if they need your help. That gives students confidence to work through it. And then that they don't sit there and stare at a problem for 3 hours and feel like they can't do it. You can help them make progress. And I think, it's just, class time is precious, but at the same time, how are we using that class time effectively? And that's one of the big things is the student needs to be actively doing it. We call it active learning in many different aspects, but working on an assignment in your class is something else that is helpful.
Practice, 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 right? We all do better with. Thank you for that. Patty, we also had a clarifying question that came up earlier in the chat when you had mentioned the myth of learning styles. I was hoping you could sort of speak to that a little bit, what you meant and what folks have learned about the different learning styles of, again, addressing the myth of it, and what is real and what is not in terms of what we've been presented with learning styles of different students.
Ooh, so I don't have my history lesson totally prepared for this one, but I do know that when I was being trained as a teacher, learning styles was huge, and we were encouraged to help students identify, I don't know if I can remember them all, but were you a kinesthetic or mechanical learner? Like, you had to do something tactilely. Were you a visual learner? Were you an auditorial learner? I think maybe the other one is experiential, but we have this idea that, like, if students could just tap into, or faculty could just tap into the style of learning that the student responded to best, then that would help those students learn better. And we know now that that's not true, that it's a myth, that everybody needs all of those different styles. You might prefer a particular style. Like, you might say, like, when you take the Myers-Briggs, sometimes they'll ask you, like, do you prefer directions or a map? Things like that. But so much of that we're realizing is situation based too. I mean, sometimes I prefer a map. Sometimes I want a list of go left, go right, look for this landmark. So we know that, like, so learning styles is a myth, but the one way that you can incorporate that, if you really love it and want to hang on to this idea that there are different ways of presenting material, and I think that's a good thing, is we call it multimodal presentation and multimodal learning. So if you're going to deliver content, don't just have a textbook. Maybe give the students the option of, like, you can learn about this topic by reading. You can learn about this topic through a podcast. You can learn about this topic through a video that I put up. Maybe if I don't want to rely on multiple things like that, because it's too much work and I'm going to lecture, you can watch my video of the lecture. I'm going to just pull the audio and you can listen to the audio of my lecture. So I have to do the lecture in such a way that you don't need visuals. Or I'm going to put up a transcription of the lecture so that you can just read it. So that's another way that you could do it. And not only is that good for accessibility and ADA reasons, but it helps students, it helps them be flexible. So, you know, the student who is a parent and can only do their work after their kids are in bed, they maybe don't want to listen to a video or an audio because maybe they don't have the equipment to, you know, headphones. So maybe they would prefer to read a text. But then if they could do their work at some other point in the day, maybe they would prefer a different way of learning. So yes, I'm looking in the chat. It's like universal design. So it's basically taking the idea of learning styles and saying all the learning styles are good for everybody. Let's make the educational experience rich enough so that people they've got visual ways of learning, they've got auditorial ways of learning, and they're mechanically, they're doing something to learn as well. They're not just passively taking information in.
And someone will have to correct me, but I think in the quality matters framework, I think multimodal instruction is one of the points that you have to get. I don't know if anyone else is familiar, but I'm pretty sure that exists too. And I wanted to add to what Patty was saying. On top of multimodal instruction, you have to remember the varying backgrounds of your students and where they come from. So in adding to supportive, you still have differentiated instruction too, that you're meeting the needs of different students.
Thank you. Appreciate that, addressing our audience members' questions. We're talking a lot about all these different practices and theories. This is not necessarily a math question, Ryan, but it could be. We're talking measurement. Patty, you also talked about assessment of students, but you know, just in terms of talking about like having an evidence base for teaching practices, how are faculty and institutions actually measuring the effectiveness of what they're doing in the classroom? Can you give a couple of examples of what you're seeing and potentially ideas for how folks might do this in their own classroom? Patty, let's start with you. Well, actually, I said Ryan, sorry. We'll call you in.
Yeah, you said Ryan.
She did say me, but Patty, if you have a prepared answer, you can go ahead. I'm trying to think. Well, I know a couple of things I'll throw out there. We've done some studies on metacognition, and I wanted to work this into the conversation at some point because Patty and I have both mentioned cognitive science and learning science. But we are finding that it is helpful to actually address metacognition to our students in classes. And one of the things that we've done is with faculty that have agreed to participate, they give the first exam, they let students see how well they do on the first exam, and then they present this, it's not a lecture, but modules about metacognition and about learning science and about how to study, ways that would help you prepare for an exam. And the students respond to the survey about what they've done to prepare for that exam. And then when they take the second exam, they look to see if there is improvement between the first and second exam scores. And, you know, I mean, some statisticians argue about how concrete that can be, but I would say when you move the needle, it's still something to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, measuring learning is really hard because there are so many variables. So and Ryan and Megan, you were part of our team and we were implementing adaptive courseware. Well, if there were gains in student learning and the proxy for that was the student's final grade, if the student's final grade on average was better than it had been historically, particularly disaggregate data for particular groups of students, we would say, oh, that was successful. Now, was it successful because we added the digital learning tool? Was it successful because the training that we provided to the faculty around the digital learning tool made them a more conscientious or better or evidence-based teacher? Was it what Ryan was saying, the metacognition, because the adaptive learning often gives students a sense of how they're learning and gives them milestones that they can chart. So students have a really good sense of their own learning. Is it that it's hard to measure that. We don't really know, but like Ryan said, that we're doing interventions, we're seeing what seems to move the needle. We can't say exactly why, but but we're making progress. There are other ways to measure though. Like I know for our QEP, like I said, we're doing critical thinking. We've developed a tool, and we have a rubric for scoring it, and that's a little more scientific methodology when it comes to, did we move students in terms of critical thinking based on these criteria? So I'm not the best person to talk to about designing measurements for learning, but I trust the people who do that because they do it really well and they're trained to do it.
Ryan, did you want to add anything? Look like you're coming off mute.
Well, I just have lots of thoughts. I think as a mathematician, one of the hardest things to do when you're working with a student that's trying to measure something or do a research question, it's how do I measure that? And I think that the more you can involve the people involved with institutional research wherever you're at, and the more that you can look at existing literature to see how they measured it and then trying to recreate that study is also very helpful. So we've got a lot of great literature pieces out there about how they organized a study. And then we can always think about, well, how could I go one step further? Or how do I add another year to this? Patty mentioned looking at the quality enhancement program, and in the same at U of L, we are using this holistic approach of measuring critical thinking within this discipline on this rubric, but we do it year over year over year. And we want to see how those things change. Another thing that we're proud of in our developmental math section is that we're continuing to watch how different students from different socioeconomic backgrounds perform as far as a pass rate. And we would like to see that those numbers are the same. And when they're different, we know that we need to have some action and we want to keep them the same. So I think that while we can't, like Patty said, we can't just pinpoint exactly how much we've used or moved the needle very often, it's that we're looking for any improvement that could exist.
And I'm hearing you both speaking about not only it's hard to measure sometimes because there's so many different things going on, always confounding variables. But what we've certainly seen across our network approach of doing this work with institutions, and I think at the institutional level, for those of us who've done this work on the ground, find that it's never just one thing. It's always, and kind of integrated and holistic approach, right? You're not only are you adopting a technology potentially, but you're doing it effectively, and that requires perhaps a course redesign. It might also involve a rethinking of what sort of pedagogical practices you're doing in the classroom and who you're talking to on campus. We also really encourage folks to don't do this alone, right? You don't have to teach, it doesn't have to be a solitary sport, right? You've got a whole institution, available to you. We realize there's different, resources available on different campuses in terms of what faculty do have available to them, but it is a community effort at many times. So thinking about who are the folks on your campus that you could be talking to that you might not be already, whether it's your colleagues in your department or the Teaching and Learning Center. Ryan had mentioned institutional research as well. Really thinking about some of the folks that you might want to talk to. Patty and Ryan, did you want to speak to that at all? Just perhaps some of the things that faculty might want to be thinking about if they're wanting to get started in this work. Who should they be reaching out to first on their campuses to have these conversations? If they feel that those resources aren't available on their campuses, where can they find out more information to kind of get started and find a community of support? Patty?
Well, on your campus, and again, Megan, not everyone has these resources, but your librarians, the folks in IT, particularly the people who oversee digital technologies, learning technologies, learning specialists, instructional designers, institutional research, centers for teaching and learning, those folks, the people who do faculty development, those are all people that if you have those resources, you should tap into them. If you don't have those resources, a lot of faculty, we actually found EveryLearner through Titan Partners did some surveys of faculty and in their time for class series, and found that a lot of faculty during COVID were going to their discipline associations like the American Historical Association. They were providing resources for faculty. They were providing communities of practice for faculty, like how do we get through this together? So that's just one way you can get that help if you are not tapped into, your university or your community college doesn't have those resources available. But you could also just create, Megan, you talked about doing this work collaboratively. You could also just create your own team. If I work with, several other people in a department, and we all teach the same thing, we could get together informally and talk about how is this going? What are you using? And help each other with the redesign and help each other with the different aspects of designing the course. So it doesn't have to be formally trained organizations and resources. It could just be a bunch of experienced teachers getting together and helping each other.
I wanted to add, I would agree with all of Patty's list, and I have one thing to add that probably narrows it down to a smaller subset here. But if anyone ever has access to a graduate student in a college of education that's working on an EDD or a PhD in education, they are looking for work to answer these research questions about teaching and learning. And this is a wonderful project for them to collaborate with. And that doesn't even have to be at your university. It can be someone at any university that's trying to get a degree in education like that. And I think it makes an excellent team member. Megan, there's a question in the Q&A that I just saw because it's separate from the chat. And I wanted to respond. They were asking if the meeting with students one-on-one is an evidence-based practice. And yes, it is. It is one of the evidence-based practices. And I think just to reiterate that students like to hear from their professor. Even though I have TAs that help me with some of my courses, they enjoy hearing from the main faculty member. So much as I sent like a grade progress report update and had students comment that, oh my gosh, Dr. Luke, I can't believe you're actually paying attention to my grade. Thank you so much. But yes, evidence-based practice.
Yeah, I'll just second that. When we did the focus groups for adaptive courseware, the students overwhelmingly liked the digital learning tools, but they did say at the end of the day, it was the relationship with the faculty member that made or didn't make the course for them. Like that really mattered to them. They wanted to know that the faculty member cared about them, wanted them to succeed, supported them, and just had a relationship with them. It was another human being in the learning space with them. That really made a difference for students in terms of their sense of belonging in both the course and at their institution.
Thanks, Patty, for always bringing us back home of why we're doing this work for our students and having a nice old-fashioned human connection between folks, faculty and students. So appreciate you speaking to that. And it's a nice way to round out this conversation. I want to thank you both again for joining us today for this conversation, and to our audience members for your engaging questions. And hopefully you've enjoyed this discussion today. Norma, I'll hand things back over to you.
Norma, you're on mute.
You're on mute.
That's a good thing when I'm on mute. I want to thank Megan and Ryan and Patty for such a wonderfully engaging conversation today. We do ask that our audience take a few minutes to complete our survey for today's presentation using the link that we're putting in the chat. If you've got something to do right after the webinar, don't worry, we will send you the link to the survey when we send you the recording link. You should be getting that email on Monday. So real quick, just a few little tidbits. Coming this fall, EveryLearner Everywhere, we are going to be offering something similar to what this is with our virtual interactive conference series. We're going to call it something else, but right now we're going to look at it as our 2.0. We're going to have nationally renowned guests. We're going to have synchronous and asynchronous events, and we're going to have digital learning topics for the future. So please stay tuned for more information. You can, we encourage you to visit the Every Learner Everywhere website occasionally or frequently if you want, and see what we've got posted there when we get the dates and times and how this is going to work with registration. Visit our resources page. Patty referenced some things on our resources page that will be helpful for evidence-based teaching as well as other topics. And once again, please explore the Expert Network page and reach out and get your complimentary session from a coaching session from the Expert Network. But once again, thank you to our moderators. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to our audience for participating in today's discussion. We look forward to seeing you this fall for our next interactive conference series. So I hope you all have a wonderful day.